Hello. Not long ago, I made this black walnut dining table. We wanted some matching seating to go with it, so I was tasked with putting together two benches. The boards I'm placing on my assembly table have already been milled down from their rough sawn form and are intentionally several inches longer than the final product. I already had laid the boards out in the orientation that I wanted based on their appearance, and their widths were fine-tuned on the table saw. From here, I merely needed to glue them edge to edge into a wider glue up to get the final bench dimensions. I could just slap some glue on there and clamp them together, but to help with alignment and for some additional strength, I'll be adding wooden dowels in between the two glue joints. I begin this process by lining all the boards up and clamping them together. Then I scribe a line across the top of the glue joints at 12-inch intervals. This marks where my dowels will be. Next, I flip the boards on their edges and transfer the lines from the faces onto the edges. This will serve as the reference line when drilling for the dowels. Accuracy matters here, because if the dowels are skewed, the boards won't come together during the glue up. I use this self-centering dowel jig for the drilling application. It's easy to set up and produces nice repeatable results. I'll be using half-inch dowels, so all I need to do is line up the half-inch guide hole with a scribed line on the board and drill it out. The dowels are going to be 3 inches in length, so my drill bit has a stop collar secured to ensure all the drill depths are 1.5 inches. Well, actually I go about 1/8 of an inch deeper on the depth just to ensure the dowels won't sit too proud. That would be disastrous were it to happen during the glue up. In other words, I can't have the dowels bottom out during the glue up and prevent the boards from coming completely together. With the dowel holes completed, I can start making the dowels themselves. I'm custom cutting these from a 3-foot dowel rod. Home improvement and woodworking stores do sell prefabricated dowels, but there aren't any stocked locally with the dimensions I wanted. The dowels are cut to length, but they're smooth all around, so here I'm adding flutes to the sides. This step is important because if left smooth, the air and glue in the dowel's hole has nowhere to escape and will cause resistance as the dowel is hammered in. This isn't something that you can power through. It's literally impossible to get the dowels to bottom out if they're smooth. This is why dowels used for this application are always fluted. Adding these grooves allows air and glue to escape as the dowel is hammered into place. This is a slightly tedious process, but there's something really satisfying about smacking these dowels through and watching the wood curl up on the sides of the channel locks. The final step for the dowels is to add chamfers on the ends. This makes it easier to get them started when they're hammered in, and also when clamping the boards together for the glue up. I like to insert the dowels into an electric drill and run it across a piece of sandpaper. Here you can see the dowels have a slight chamfer on the ends. One quick test fit before committing to the glue up, and she's perfect. Now I'm adding a small glob of glue into each hole and coating half the dowel before hammering it into place. I can pretty much feel when the dowel's bottomed out, but just to be sure, I check the depth of each one before moving on. I clean up any glue squeeze out because I'm not quite ready to glue the boards together. Now, if you're keen, you'll notice a mistake I'm making here. There are going to be 2 glue joints, and so I should be inserting dowels into one side of each of those joints. But I've accidentally added dowels to 2 sides of one of them. Once I realized this mistake, it was too late to pull them out, so I had to flush cut them off, and then re-drill the holes. Thankfully, I made more dowels than I needed. With the dowels all put into place, I lay all the boards out on my clamps to begin the glue up. I've only been showing 3 boards so far, but there are actually a total of 6, because I'm making 2 benches. Boards 1, 2, and 3 will be glued together, as well as boards 4, 5, and 6. Even though all the boards are being clamped together here, there isn't any glue between boards 3 and 4, so once this process is complete, I'll be left with 2 separate bench tops. I let the glue cure for about 24 hours before removing the clamps and moving to the next step. Because I was generous with the glue, there is some squeeze out and runoff between the joints, so I clean off the big nibs with a putty knife. Now is a good time to trim the board's length, resulting in a nice clean straight edge. The track saw makes short work of this. I've still got a considerable amount of dried glue to clean up, so I get to work with my belt sander. This is an aggressive sanding method, so I need to be careful not to overdo it. The belt sander removes a lot of stock quickly. This is a lower grade of walnut and has lots of defects in the form of knots. I can't leave them as is because, for one, they aren't stable. Some of those knots could, over time, come loose and pop out. But even if they didn't, they present spots for food to get trapped, and there will be kids sitting on this, so it needs to be addressed. The first step is to clean out those defects. Any loose areas need to be removed and tidied up. This piece here was the biggest one, but I have to say it was pretty satisfying when it came out. For the smaller defects, I clean it up with a needle file inserted into my drill. Bit of a poor man's version of a Dremel. With all the defects cleaned out, now I need to fill them with something hard and stable. This is where epoxy comes in. I do this in two stages. First, I brush a layer of epoxy inside the knot holes. After about an hour, I pour the full volume. This allows the first coating to slightly harden and plug up the porous nature of the wood. This defect is unfortunately on the edge, so I'm creating a dam which will hold the epoxy in while it cures. Parchment paper works well because the epoxy doesn't stick to it. Now I move on to the full depth pours. I'm dyeing the epoxy black because it'll go nicely with the wood color for the final product. I always pour more than the hole seems to demand because I'd rather have more than not enough. It's all going to get sanded down in the end anyway. Lastly, I pop any bubbles that have floated to the surface with a blowtorch. This step is important because the bubbles don't break the surface tension on their own and they will stay trapped. This phenomenon is less noticeable with black epoxy, but absolutely critical with clear. After a day, I came back and peeled off the tape and parchment paper from that edge knot, and I was quite happy with how it held up. Out comes the belt sander again to flush up the epoxy pores with the wood. I flip the panel over and get to work on the other side. This side will be the bottom. And now it becomes a rinse and repeat process of cleaning out knot holes and filling them up with black epoxy. Another day goes by, and I flush up the epoxy pores with the wood surface for this side. Now it's time to integrate the bench legs. Here I'm working out the dimensions and then tracing an outline of the base plate. I'm doing this because I'm going to be routing out a small recess so the base plate is flush with the bench's bottom. This isn't really necessary, but it's just that extra little element that looks nice. I'm routing out the recess here with a 1/2-inch spiral upcut bit. This bit is a beast and makes short work of this step. I begin by routing out the edges using a straight edge as a guide, and once I have the perimeter outlined, I can freehand the rest of the material. Quick test fit, and then I'm ready to start drilling the holes for the hardware. I mark the center of the holes with a brad point drill bit. The hardware is going to be these threaded inserts, which screw permanently into the wood, and furniture bolts, which thread into the inserts themselves. I start each hole with a brad point drill bit because brad points don't have a tendency to wander from their marks. Precision is very important here. I'm not drilling the full intended depth with this bit because the brad point sticks out too far and I don't want the risk blowing out the top. So for the precision depth, I switched to a conventional bit with a stop collar. I had to use this piece of aluminum flat bar as a reference plane for the stop collar because the hole locations were too close to the lip of the recess. The flat bar allowed for a clean and consistent point to reference. Again, I can't risk blowing out the top of the bench. I then add a small countersink to the holes. This is only because the threaded inserts have a slight countersink at the top of them. Doing this ensures the inserts will sit at or beneath the surface of the wood. Now it's just a matter of installing the inserts. I'm ready to begin finish sanding. The belt sander may have made the epoxy mostly even with the top and helped with any misalignment between the boards, but it's an aggressive tool and leaves lots of marks behind. The first and most crucial part in the finish process is to eliminate those scratches. The best tool for this is a random orbit sander. I get to work starting with 80 grit sandpaper and a light to help identify scratches. I work as long as it takes on every inch. Any scratches which are visible now will stay visible until the final product. Thoroughness is imperative at this stage. Here's what those scratches look like before, and here's the after. Before and after. I make sure to sand the edges of the bench as well. Before sanding with the next grit, I mark the entire surface lightly with a pencil. While with the previous grit I could see the scratches with a light, that isn't possible now. The pencil marks help me track where I have and haven't sanded. Once all the pencil marks are gone, that grit of paper is done. The final sanding will be with 180 grit, but before doing that, now's a good time to round over the edge of the bench with a trim router. I used this 1/8 inch round over bit to achieve that nice soft edge all around. Now I move on to the final sanding grit. I flip the benches over and repeat this process for the tops. After sanding with the final grit, I then spritz both sides of the benches with water. This causes any severed wood fibers to stand on end. I can then very lightly sand again with the final grit to knock those wood fibers down. If I skipped this step, the grain would raise when I apply the finish and leave a rough feeling surface. Thankfully, this is the last sanding I have to do. Before applying the finish, I wipe down all the surfaces with mineral spirits. This picks up any lingering sawdust, removes any oil left behind from my hands, and makes the surface dry and ready to accept the finish oil. This shot right here is the money shot. Here's where all the hard work pays off and the wood grain springs to life. I use a buffer with a terry cloth to help ensure even coating. I flip them over and finish the top and edges, and then she's done. I'm really happy with how this project came out. It took a lot of work, but I know that solid hardwood like this will outlive me, and it suits our needs perfectly. Now I just need to come to terms with the fact that our kids are going to make these benches less than perfect. But maybe that's the whole point. Life is messy, and perhaps these benches will be an accurate reflection of that. Only time will tell. Thanks for watching. Take care.